By the end of this video, you will not only know the exact settings that will help you to create the most cinematic image possible with the Osmo Pocket 3, but you'll also learn some shooting tips that will help you to maximize the use of this little camera. Because after all, settings only get you so far. So hopefully you have your Osmo out so you can follow along, but if you don't worry about it. The steps are fairly simple to remember. So swipe up, this is gonna give you your resolution and frame rate options. I would leave your resolution on 4K because you want the best image possible, the best video quality possible that the camera shoots in. As far as your frame rate options, I would go with either 24 or 25 frames a second. If you're in North America, 24 frames a second. And if you're in other countries, 25 frames a second. These are the standard frame rates that you see in movies and TV shows. But if you want slow motion, then you would choose either 50 or 60. So if you're in North America, 60. If you're in the rest of the countries that use PAL, you would do 50 FPS. So I'm from the US, I use 24 frames a second, and when I want slow motion, then I use 60 frames a second. Then you're gonna swipe right, and this is gonna bring up your settings menu. You're gonna wanna switch this to Pro just by hitting Pro. This will give you full access to change all of the settings in your camera for the most part, so then you can get a more cinematic image per se. So let's start with exposure. Just by hitting that, you'll see on the left, you have your shutter speed. On the right, you have your ISO. And for your shutter speed, a typical rule to remember is whatever your frame rate is, you double that, and that's where your shutter speed should be. So in this instance, we're shooting at 24 FPS. You double that and you get 48, but there is no 48 on the camera, so we round up to 1/50th of a second. And we do this because it gives us the most natural looking motion blur possible. We see blur in our daily lives when things are moving and moving fast, and by doubling your frame rate, this is going to give you something very similar to what we naturally see. So if you're shooting at, say, 60 FPS, you would bump this up to 1/120th. But let's bring this down to 1/50th of a second because we're shooting at 24 FPS. Your ISO, you want to keep this as low as possible, as often as possible. The higher your ISO is, the more noise is going to be introduced into the image. I would recommend leaving it on 50 to 400 range. This is kind of an auto ISO. So if you're in a dark area, it'll bump it up to maybe 400. If it goes higher than 400, you'll see quite a bit more noise. But typically, if you know that you can control your lighting pretty well, I would leave this on either 50 or 100. But once again, if you have changing lighting, I would switch this to 50 to 400 range and then hit confirm. For your white balance, I often leave this at 5600 Kelvin because either I'm shooting outside or I'm shooting in the studio. My lights are 5600 Kelvin, daylight's 5600 Kelvin, so usually it works out. But if there's mixed lighting or something's going on, say I'm shooting indoors with a lot of tungsten light, what I'll do is change it to auto white balance. This will adjust it for me. That way you can see what the white balance of the environment is. You can switch back to manual and go and find that Kelvin value and then hit confirm. But the auto white balance on this camera does pretty well. Usually you want to lock in your white balance though. The next thing you're going to do is change your picture profile. So go to color, we're going to switch this to D-Log M 10-bit. This is log footage, so it's going to give you the most tonal range and color information that this camera can shoot in. So we want to have this on to make sure that we can capture as much detail in our highlights and shadows as possible in one image, as well as with 10-bit, give us the most color information possible in each shot. If you go down to focus mode, you'll see we have a couple different options here. We have single, continuous, and product showcase. Usually I leave this on continuous. This is going to continually focus depending on what you're aiming your camera at, but single can be useful. Once you lock focus to the object of your choice, if you happen to do, say, a pan or something, it's going to stay locked on to that object even if you're panning slightly away. So that can come in handy, but most of the time I just leave it on continuous. Then you have image adjustment. I don't like the camera to do any type of noise reduction or sharpening in camera. Usually it doesn't look that good. And I actually prefer in all my cameras, even the one you're looking at right now, to decrease the sharpness and noise reduction. So I would adjust the sharpness to -1 and the noise reduction to -1. You can play around with this, perhaps change the sharpness to -2 if you really want. Now this would be incredibly annoying to set up every time you shoot. So after you do all this, swipe down, you're gonna hit this person button on the top, and this is gonna allow you to save all those settings. So I already have all those settings saved to C1. If you'll see C1 here on your camera, if you don't have any of these set up, press that and hit save. That way when you go out and shoot and you want to have all those settings already adjusted, you hit your camera button down here and you go to whatever custom setting that was. So for us, that was C1. And once again, if you want a slow motion option, so video shot in a higher frame rate, adjust your frame rate, adjust your shutter speed, and then save that to C2. If you keep the exposure of the Pocket 3 on automatic, the camera will adjust the shutter speed to get a good exposure. But because we have manually set the shutter speed, so we get that natural looking motion blur, we have to use these things. This is called a variable ND filter. It's kind of like sunglasses for your camera. So because we want to keep that shutter speed a little bit more open, this helps us to keep our exposure at a good level. And a suggestion for you is to get an ND filter that has a mist filter built in. This is Freewell's Mist ND filters, I believe. And that just adds some blooming of the highlights. It almost makes it a little dreamy, as well as some softening of the highlights and skin. And this is something that makes footage a lot more cinematic, in my opinion. There's a rule in cinematography called the rule of thirds, which basically states that for a more pleasing image, you should put your subject on one of the lines in your guide frame. You can set this up on your Pocket 3 by swiping down, going to the settings menu, go down to reference line, and turn on your grid. Now you can line up your subject to create more cinematic framing. But what happens when you want to use active track? The issue with using active track in the Pocket 3 is it'll always place you dead center. The way around this is by hitting your Smart Gimbal Modes menu and going to Dynamic Framing. Hit Start, and use the joystick to choose where active track will keep your subject in the frame. That way, the camera will track you and keep you in one of those sections of the frame to help you achieve more cinematic framing. Another tip is to use the weight and size of the camera to its advantage. Use a pole for shots that would typically require an expensive jib or crane to get really unique camera angles and movements. Pick up devices like this suction mount to place the Pocket 3 at interesting angles and positions. This camera's 1-inch sensor is surprisingly good, so use the weight and size of this camera to your advantage. Another tip when using this camera is to make sure to do what's called a ninja walk, where you try and walk slowly from heel to toe, focusing on keeping the camera level. This will help remove some of the micro jitters and shakes that you might typically have. And if you find that you're still not happy with how smooth your shots are, try adding a little extra weight to the camera. This may seem counterintuitive, but it does go a long way in helping to make those sharp shakes turn into more gradual motion. And lastly, and this is probably the most important point, you gotta know how to color grade log footage and tweak it the correct way. Because if not, your shot's gonna end up looking like this when you bring it into your editing software. And if you use Final Cut Pro, I have an in-depth color grading masterclass that will essentially take you from 0 to hero. I will link that in the description. I'm very proud of it. And for the rest of you, there are tutorials online that you can watch. I wish you all the best and thank you for watching.